The clock on the wall showed 2:15 a.m., but nobody in the Technova Solutions office was thinking about sleep. The CEO, David Kim, stood in front of a wall of monitors, watching his company's entire world crumble in real time. Red warning lights flashed across every screen. Error messages popped up faster than anyone could read them. The sound of phones ringing non-stop filled the air like an alarm that wouldn't quit. "Sir, we just lost another client," called out one of the engineers from across the room. His voice was shaky, tired from working for 18 straight hours. "That's 12 major companies down now. Their systems are completely frozen." David felt his stomach drop. 12 companies. That meant hospitals couldn't access patient records. Banks couldn't process transactions. Shipping companies couldn't track their packages. Thousands of workers couldn't do their jobs because of his company's mistake. The problem had started small, just like problems always do. One tiny glitch in their artificial intelligence system. Something so small that the computers should have fixed it automatically. But instead of getting better, it got worse, much worse. The glitch spread through their network like a virus, taking down system after system. Now it was threatening to destroy everything David had built over the past 15 years. "What's the latest damage report?" David asked his chief technology officer, trying to keep his voice steady. Inside he was panicking. This was the kind of crisis that could end careers and destroy companies overnight. "We're looking at potential losses of over $200 million if we can't fix this in the next few hours," came the reply. "The clients are already talking about switching to our competitors. Some are threatening to sue us." $200 million. David had heard those numbers before, but only in success stories. Never in disaster stories. Never when talking about his own company. He thought about his employees, about their families, about the promises he'd made to investors. All of it could disappear because of one stupid computer glitch. The engineering team was working frantically. These were some of the smartest people in the tech world. They had degrees from the best universities. They'd solved impossible problems before. But tonight, they looked defeated. Their usual confidence was gone, replaced by the desperate look of people who knew they were running out of time. "We've tried everything," said the lead engineer, rubbing his tired eyes. "We've rebooted the servers, rolled back the code, even tried rebuilding the entire system from scratch. Nothing works. Every time we think we've fixed it, 10 more problems pop up." David walked over to the whiteboard where someone had drawn a messy diagram of their computer network. Lines connected boxes in a pattern that looked more like a spider web than an organized system. Numbers and code were scribbled everywhere. It was the kind of mess that happens when smart people are working under pressure and running out of ideas. "Maybe we should call in outside help," suggested someone from the back of the room. "There's a consulting firm in Boston that specializes in this kind of crisis. By the time they get here and understand our system, it'll be too late," David replied. "We need to solve this ourselves, and we need to solve it now." He looked around the room at his team. Some of them had been with him since the beginning, when Technova was just 3 people working out of a garage. Others were newer, brilliant minds he'd recruited from big companies like Google and Microsoft. All of them looked exhausted. All of them looked worried. The office was a mess. Empty coffee cups were everywhere. Someone had ordered pizza hours ago, but most of it sat untouched on the conference table. Stress had killed everyone's appetite. The cleaning crew had given up trying to work around the chaos and had mostly stayed out of the way, except for one person. Maria Santos, the night housekeeper, continued her work quietly in the background. She'd been cleaning offices for Technova for almost 3 years now. She knew the building better than most of the employees. She knew which lights to turn off, which computers to leave running, and which coffee machines needed to be cleaned. Every night, Maria had started working at Technova when she first moved to the city. She needed a job that would let her work around her other responsibilities. During the day, she took English classes at the community college. In the evenings, she helped her teenage daughter with homework. The night shift cleaning job was perfect. Because it paid well and gave her the flexibility she needed, she'd seen plenty of late-night emergencies before. Software companies always seemed to have crises that required everyone to work through the night. But this felt different. Usually, the engineers would be excited, energized by the challenge of solving a difficult problem. Tonight, they looked scared. Maria understood more than people realized. Before cleaning offices, she'd worked at a shipping company doing data entry. She'd learned how computer systems worked, how information flowed from one place to another. She'd seen what happened when systems got overloaded, when too much information tried to move through pathways that weren't big enough to handle it. As she emptied trash cans and wiped down desks, Maria listened to the conversations around her. The engineers were using big technical words, but underneath all the complicated language, she could hear the real problem. Their system was trying to do too many things at once. It was like trying to push a river through a drinking straw. "We need to check every line of code," one engineer was saying. "There has to be a bug somewhere that we're missing." "We've already checked the code 5 times, another replied. "The problem isn't in the code, it's something else." Maria paused in her cleaning, listening more carefully. She'd heard this kind of argument before at the shipping company. The programmers would spend weeks looking for complicated problems when the real issue was something simple. Usually it was about the way information moved through the system. Not the information itself. She wanted to say something, but she knew her place. She was the cleaning lady. These were some of the smartest people in the tech industry. What could she possibly know that they didn't? But as she continued working, moving from desk to desk, Maria kept thinking about the problem. She'd seen the diagrams on the whiteboards. She'd overheard enough conversations to understand what was happening. And the more she thought about it, the more she was convinced that everyone was looking in the wrong place. The clock now showed 2:45 a.m. David was on another phone call with an angry client. The engineering team was still frantically typing code and running tests. And Maria continued her quiet work, watching, listening, and thinking about traffic jams and drinking straws and the simple solution that nobody else seemed to see. Maria moved through the office like a ghost, her footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. She'd perfected the art of being invisible during her 3 years working the night shift. In a world where everyone was rushing to meetings and shouting into phones, she'd learned that sometimes the best way to understand what was really happening was to stay quiet and pay attention. Tonight was different, though. The usual energy of the office had been replaced by something heavier, fear. She could feel it in the way people talked, in the way they moved, in the way they kept checking their phones hoping for good news that never came. As she organized the scattered papers on one of the desks, Maria couldn't help but notice the patterns. Numbers, charts, diagrams that looked like maps of a city she'd never visited. But the more she looked, the more familiar they became. The lines connecting different boxes reminded her of something from her previous job at the shipping company. Back then, she'd worked in the main warehouse for Allied Logistics. Her job was simple on paper: enter data about packages into the computer system. But Maria had always been curious about how things worked. During her breaks, she'd walk around the warehouse, watching how packages moved from one station to another. She'd noticed that problems always happened in the same places. The conveyor belts would jam when too many packages tried to go through the sorting station at once. The loading dock would get backed up when trucks arrived faster than they could be unloaded. The managers would call in expensive consultants to solve these problems. They'd create fancy presentations and complicated charts. But Maria had seen the real issue. It wasn't that the equipment was broken or that the workers were lazy. It was that too much stuff was trying to move through spaces that weren't big enough to handle it all at once. She'd tried to explain this to her supervisor once. "Maybe we could spread out the deliveries," she'd suggested. "Instead of having all the trucks come at 2 p.m., we could have some come at 1 p.m. and others at 3 p.m. Her supervisor had smiled politely and told her to focus on her data entry work. 2 weeks later, an expensive consultant had made the exact same suggestion. Suddenly, it was brilliant. The company paid thousands of dollars for advice that their data entry clerk had offered for free. Now, Looking at the diagrams on the whiteboard, Maria felt that familiar feeling. She was seeing the same problem again, just in a different form. Instead of packages backing up on conveyor belts, it was information backing up in computer networks. Instead of trucks causing traffic jams at the loading dock, it was data causing traffic jams in the system. She moved closer to the whiteboard, pretending to clean the area around it. The engineers had drawn their network like a tree, with one main trunk and lots of branches, but Maria could see the problem. Everything was trying to flow through the same narrow point. It was like trying to empty a swimming pool through a garden. "Hose, we need to optimize the algorithm," one of the engineers was saying to another. "Maybe if we compress the data packets, we can squeeze more through the pipeline," Maria almost laughed. Compress the data packets? That was like trying to solve a traffic jam by making the cars smaller. It might help a little, but it wouldn't fix the real problem. She thought about her daughter, Sophia, who was studying for her driver's license. Just last week, they'd been talking about traffic flow in their neighborhood. There was always a backup on Oak Street during rush hour because everyone was trying to get to the highway using the same road. "Why don't people use Pine Street?" Sophia had asked. "It goes to the same place." "Because they don't know about it," Maria had explained. "Everyone follows the GPS, and the GPS always suggests the same route. So everyone uses Oak Street, and Pine Street stays empty." That was exactly what was happening here. The computer system was like a neighborhood with only one road leading to the highway. Every piece of information was trying to use the same path, creating a massive traffic jam. She looked at the diagram again. There were other paths, other ways for the information to flow, but they weren't being used. The system was set up to push everything through the main channel, even when that channel was completely clogged. Maria had seen this before, not just at the shipping company, but everywhere. At the grocery store, where she sometimes worked weekend shifts, customers would stand in long lines at the self-checkout machines while the regular checkout lanes sat empty. At the DMV, people would wait hours in the wrong line because the signs weren't clear. At her daughter's school, parents would create chaos in the parking lot by all trying to use the same entrance. The solutions were always simple. Open another checkout lane. Put up better signs. Use the back entrance. But people in charge always seemed to look for complicated answers to simple problems. She continued her work, moving from desk to desk, listening to the conversations around her. The engineers were brilliant, she knew that. They understood things about computers that she could never hope to learn. But sometimes being too smart could be a problem. Sometimes you could know so much about how things were supposed to work that you couldn't see how they actually did work. At 3 a.m., she overheard David on another phone call. This time it was with someone from the board of directors. The conversation was tense. "Yes, I understand the gravity of the situation," David was saying. "We have our entire team working on it. These are PhD graduates from MIT and Stanford. If anyone can solve this, they can." PhD graduates from MIT and Stanford. Maria felt a familiar pang of insecurity. She'd barely finished high school in her home country before moving to the United States. Her English was good now, but she still felt self-conscious about her accent. She was taking classes at the community college, working toward an associate's degree, but that seemed like nothing compared to the credentials of the people around her. Who was she to think she understood something that they didn't? She was just the cleaning lady. She was supposed to empty trash cans and wipe down desks, not solve multi-million-dollar computer problems, but as she worked, the solution kept nagging at her. It was so clear, so obvious, like seeing a door that everyone was walking past because they were too busy looking at the walls. She thought about all the times in her life when she'd seen the answer but stayed quiet. When she'd been working at the shipping company and watched expensive consultants get paid for ideas she'd had months earlier. When she'd been in meetings at Sophia's school and known exactly what was causing the problems but been too intimidated to speak up. She thought about Sophia, who was now 17 and planning to study engineering in college. What would she want her mother to do? Would she want her to stay quiet and invisible, or would she want her to be brave? Maria looked at the clock. It was 3:15 a.m. The crisis was getting worse. More clients were calling to complain. More systems were failing. The engineers were getting more desperate, trying more complicated solutions that weren't working. She picked up her cleaning cloth and moved closer to the whiteboard again. This time, she didn't pretend to clean. She studied the diagram carefully, tracing the lines with her eyes, following the flow of information from one point to another. The answer was right there, waiting for someone to see it. Someone who understood that sometimes the best solutions weren't complicated. Someone who knew that traffic jams weren't solved by making the cars smaller, but by opening new roads. Someone who was brave enough to speak up, even when she was just the cleaning lady. The clock hit 3:30 a.m., and Maria could feel the panic in the room growing thicker. She'd been cleaning offices long enough to recognize the signs. The way people stopped making eye contact with each other. The way conversations became shorter and more urgent. The way everyone kept checking their phones, hoping for a miracle that wasn't coming. David hung up from another difficult phone call and slumped into his chair. His hair was messy from running his hands through it. His shirt was wrinkled and there were dark circles under his eyes. This was a man who was watching his life's work fall apart, and he didn't know how to stop it. "That was the hospital group," he announced to the room. "They're switching to our competitor system first thing Monday morning. They can't afford to have their patient records locked up like this." The engineers looked up from their computers, their faces showing the same exhaustion and defeat. They'd been trying everything they could think of. Rewriting code, adjusting settings, even calling other tech companies to see if anyone had faced a similar problem. Nothing was working. "Maybe we should just shut everything down and start over," suggested one of the younger programmers. "Wipe the servers clean and rebuild from scratch." "That would take weeks," replied the senior engineer. "By then, we won't have any clients left to serve." Maria continued her work, moving slowly around the room. She'd been thinking about the problem for over an hour now, and she was more convinced than ever that she knew what was wrong. But every time she thought about speaking up, her courage failed her. What if she was wrong? What if her simple explanation was completely off base? These people had spent years studying computer science. They understood things she couldn't even pronounce. How could she possibly know something they didn't? She thought about her daughter Sophia, who would be waking up in a few hours to get ready for school. Sophia was smart, confident, always ready to speak up when she had an idea. Where had Maria gone wrong? When had she learned to stay quiet, to make herself invisible? It had started early, she realized. Growing up in a small town where women were expected to listen more than they talked. Moving to a new country where her accent made her feel different. Working jobs where she was paid to be in the background, not the center of attention, but tonight was different. Tonight, staying quiet wasn't just about her own fear. It was about people not getting the medical care they needed. It was about workers losing their jobs. It was about a man who had built something wonderful watching it get destroyed. She looked at the whiteboard again. The diagram was still there, showing the network like a tree with one main trunk. She could see the bottleneck as clearly as if it were marked with a red circle. It was right there, so obvious that she couldn't understand why no one else saw it. At 3:45 a.m. There was a brief lull in the activity. Most of the engineers had stepped away from their computers, either to get more coffee or to take a break from staring at screens. David was sitting alone at the conference table, his head in his hands. This was her chance. If she was going to speak up, it had to be now. Maria set down her cleaning supplies and walked over to where David was sitting. Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. "Excuse me, Mr. Kim," she said softly. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, barely above a whisper. David looked up, surprised. In 3 years of working there, Maria had never spoken to him directly. She'd always communicated through her supervisor or just nodded politely when they passed in the hallway. "Yes?" he said, trying to focus on her despite his exhaustion. Maria took a deep breath. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I think I might know what's wrong with your system." the room went quiet. A few engineers stopped what they were doing and looked. Someone actually laughed, though they tried to cover it with a cough. David stared at her for a moment, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry, what?" "The problem with your computers," Maria continued, her voice getting a little stronger. "I think I know how to fix it." Now everyone was looking at her. She could feel their eyes, some curious, some skeptical, some clearly thinking this was a waste of time. Her instinct was to apologize and go back to her cleaning, but she forced herself to stay where she was. "I used to work at a shipping company," she explained, pointing toward the whiteboard. "We had the same problem there. Too many packages trying to go through the same sorting station. It would back everything up for hours." One of the engineers started to say something, but David held up his hand. "Go on," he said. "Your system is like a highway with only one lane," Maria continued, gaining confidence. "All the information is trying to use the same path, but look here." She walked over to the whiteboard and pointed to some of the lines that connected different parts of the network. "You have other paths, other ways for the information to travel, but they're not being used." She turned back to David. "At the shipping company, we fixed it by opening more sorting stations. Instead of having everything go through one place, we spread it out. The packages still got where they needed to go, but they didn't all have to wait in the same line." The room was completely silent now. Everyone was staring at Maria, then at the whiteboard, then back at Maria. That's actually not impossible," said the senior engineer slowly. "We could reroute some of the data traffic through the backup channels." "But those channels aren't designed for heavy traffic," another engineer objected. "They don't need to carry heavy traffic," Maria replied. "Just enough to reduce the jam in the main channel. Like when there's construction on the highway and they tell some cars to take the side streets. The side streets aren't as fast, but they keep the highway from getting completely blocked." David stood up and walked to the whiteboard. He stared at the diagram for a long moment, then turned to his lead engineer. "Could this work?" The engineer was already pulling up code on his laptop. "It's worth a try. It would only take a few minutes to implement." "Do it," David said. The next few minutes felt like hours. Maria stood off to the side, watching as the engineers typed rapidly, making changes to their system. She felt sick, too. Her stomach. What if she was wrong? What if her simple explanation was completely off base and she'd just wasted precious time? "Okay, changes are live," announced the lead engineer. "Let's see what happens." Everyone turned to look at the monitors. For a moment, nothing changed. The red warning lights continued to flash. The error messages kept appearing. Then, slowly, things began to shift. One by one, the red lights turned yellow, then green. The error messages slowed down, then stopped. The graph showing system performance started to climb back toward normal levels. "It's working," someone whispered. "It's actually working," said another voice, louder this time. Within minutes, the system was running smoothly again. Clients were calling to report that their access had been restored. The crisis that had seemed impossible to solve was over. David turned to Maria, his eyes wide with disbelief. "How did you know?" Maria smiled for the first time all night. "Because I've been watching traffic jams my whole life. I just never realized that information could get stuck in traffic too." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Engineers who had been working frantically for hours were suddenly laughing and hugging each other. The phones were ringing again, but this time with good news instead of complaints. And in the middle of it all stood Maria, the night shift cleaning lady who had just saved a $200 million company with an idea about traffic flow and the courage to speak up when it mattered most. For the next hour, the Technova office felt like a completely different place. The stress and panic had been replaced by excitement and relief. Engineers who had been pulling their hair out just minutes before were now laughing and sharing stories about the craziest problem-solving moment of their careers. The phones were still ringing, but now clients were calling to thank them. Not to complain, Maria had quietly returned to her cleaning, trying to process what had just happened. She felt like she was in a dream. Had she really just solved a problem that had stumped some of the smartest people in the tech industry? Part of her expected someone to come over and tell her it was all a mistake, that the system had fixed itself and her suggestion had nothing to do with it. But David kept looking at her from across the room. Every few minutes she'd catch him, staring, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what had happened. Finally, around 5 a.m., he walked over to where she was organizing some papers. "Maria," he said, and she was surprised that he knew her name. "I need to ask you something. How long have you been working here?" "3 years, sir," she replied, still feeling awkward about the whole situation. "And in those 3 years have you ever noticed other problems? Things that maybe the engineering team missed?" Maria hesitated. She didn't want to seem like she was criticizing anyone. "Well, there were a few times when I thought there might be simpler ways to do things. But I figured if the engineers didn't see it, then I must be wrong." David rubbed his forehead. "Can you give me an example?" "Last year there was a problem with the backup systems. The engineers spent weeks trying to figure out why the backups kept failing. I heard them talking about it during their late night meetings. They kept checking the software, running tests, bringing in specialists. I remember that," David said. "It cost us almost $50,000 to fix. The thing is," Maria continued, "I noticed that the backup always failed on the same day of the week, Thursday and Thursday. Was the day when the cleaning crew used the industrial vacuum cleaner on the same floor as the backup servers. The vacuum was so powerful that it was causing tiny power fluctuations. Not enough to shut down the main systems, but enough to interrupt the backup process." David stared at her. "You're kidding." "I thought about mentioning it, but I figured the engineers would have thought of that if it was important. I mean, they're so much smarter than me. They know about electricity and power systems. What would I know about that?" "But you were right," Maria shrugged. "I just noticed the pattern. When you clean the same building every night for 3 years, you start to see how everything connects." David was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised everyone in the room. He stood up and called for attention. "Everyone, can I have your attention for a minute?" The room went quiet. All the engineers stopped what they were doing and looked at him. "I want to make an announcement," David continued. "As of right now, Maria Santos is being promoted to Chief Problem-Solving Officer of Technova Solutions." The room erupted in surprise. Murmurs. Someone actually dropped their coffee cup. Maria felt her face go red. "Sir, I don't understand," she said. "The salary for this position is $200,000 a year," David continued, ignoring the gasps from around the room. "Plus stock options and full benefits." Maria felt dizzy. $200,000? That was more money than she'd made in the last 5 years combined. That was enough to pay for Sophia's college tuition. That was enough to buy a house. That was enough to completely change her life. "But I don't have a degree," she protested. "I don't know anything about computer science." "You don't need to know computer science," David replied. "You need to know how to solve problems. And you just saved this company $200 million by seeing something that our entire engineering team missed." He turned to address the room. "I'm also creating a new division called Real World Solutions. This division will be staffed by people from all kinds of backgrounds. People who've worked in warehouses, hospitals, schools, restaurants. People who understand how things actually work in the real world, not just how they're supposed to work on paper." The engineers were looking at each other, trying to process what they were hearing. Some looked confused. Others looked intrigued. A few looked concerned about what this meant for their own positions. "This doesn't mean we value our technical expertise any less," David continued. "Our engineers are brilliant, and we need that brilliance. But we also need people who can see the forest for the trees. We need people who can spot the simple solutions that sometimes get overlooked when we're focused on complex problems." Maria was still trying to wrap her head around what was happening. "Mr. Kim, I appreciate this, but I don't think I'm qualified for such an important position." "Maria," David said, walking over to her, 3 hours ago, our entire company was about to collapse. Our best engineers, people with advanced degrees from top universities, couldn't solve the problem. You solved it in seconds by comparing it to traffic flow. If that doesn't qualify you, I don't know what does. He looked around the room at his employees. I've been thinking about this all wrong. We hire people based on their degrees and their test scores. We look for people who can write complex code and understand advanced algorithms. But we've been missing something important. We've been missing the people who understand how things actually work. One of the senior engineers raised his hand. David, are you saying that formal education doesn't matter? No, I'm not saying that at all, David replied. Formal education is important. We need people who understand the technical details. But we also need people who can see the big picture. We need people who can look at a problem and say, hey, this is just like the traffic jam I saw on Oak Street last week. He turned back to Maria. You mentioned that you noticed other problems. Over the years, I want you to write up a report on every single one of them. I want to know what you saw when you saw it, and what you think the solution would be. But what if I'm wrong about some of them? Maria asked. Then we'll figure it out together, David said. But I'm willing to bet that you're right about more than you think. The room was buzzing with conversation now. Engineers were talking among themselves, trying to understand what this meant for the company. Some were excited about the idea of working with people from different backgrounds. Others were worried about their job security. David addressed these concerns directly. I want to be clear about something. Nobody is getting fired. Nobody is getting demoted. We're not replacing our technical team. We're adding to it. We're creating a new way of solving problems that combines technical expertise with real-world experience. He paused, looking around the room. Tonight showed us something important. Sometimes the best solutions come from unexpected places. Sometimes the person who can solve your problem is someone you wouldn't normally think to ask. Maria felt tears starting to form in her eyes. Not just because of the money, although that was life-changing, but because for the first time in her life, someone was telling her that her perspective was valuable, that her experience mattered, that she wasn't just the cleaning lady who should stay invisible and quiet. I want to make one more announcement. David said, we're also starting a scholarship program. Any employee who wants to continue their education will have full tuition support from the company. Because learning never stops and good ideas can come from anywhere, he looked directly at Maria. That includes you. If you want to take more classes, study computer science, or learn anything else, the company will pay for it. But remember, you don't need more education to be valuable. You're already valuable exactly as you are. The sun was starting to rise outside the windows. The crisis was over. The company was saved. And Maria Santos, who had started the night as a cleaning lady, was ending it as the chief problem-solving officer of a major tech company. Sometimes the most important moments in life come when you least expect them. Sometimes they come when you're just trying to do your job, clean some offices, and make it through another night. And sometimes they come when you finally find the courage to speak up and share what you know. 6 months later, Maria sat in her new office on the 15th floor of the Technova building, looking out at the city skyline. The view was incredible, but what amazed her most was how different her life had become. She'd gone from cleaning these offices at night to having meetings in them during the day. Sometimes she still couldn't believe it was real. The transformation hadn't been easy. Those first few weeks after her promotion had been overwhelming. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to her. News reporters called asking for interviews. Other companies wanted to know how Technova had discovered their secret weapon. Maria had felt like a fraud, like someone who was pretending to be something she wasn't, but David had been patient with her. He'd hired a coach to help her adjust to her new role. He'd given her time to learn, to grow, to find her confidence. Most importantly, he'd never made her feel like she had to become someone different. He'd encouraged her to stay true to herself, to keep seeing problems the way she always had. The real-world solutions division had grown to 12 people. There was Carlos, who'd worked in a restaurant kitchen for 20 years and had an incredible ability to spot inefficiencies in any process. There was Linda, a former nurse who understood how systems needed to work when people's lives depended on them. There was Robert, who'd spent 15 years as a mechanic and could figure out why any system wasn't working properly. Each person brought something unique to the team. They didn't have computer science degrees, but they had something just as valuable. They understood how things worked in the real world. They'd seen problems from angles that the engineers never considered. The division's first major success had come just 2 months after it was formed. Technova had been working on a new app for hospitals to track medical equipment. The engineering team had created something that worked perfectly in tests. But when hospitals tried to use it, they complained that it was too complicated and time-consuming. Linda had looked at the app and immediately saw the problem. "This is designed by people who've never worked in a hospital," she'd said. "In a hospital, you don't have time to click through 5 screens to find a piece of equipment. You need to know where it is right now, this second." She'd worked with the engineers to redesign the app. Instead of fancy graphics and multiple menus, they'd created something that looked more like a simple map. Equipment showed up as colored dots. If you needed something, you could see exactly where it was with one glance. The redesigned app had been so successful that hospitals across the country were now using it. The story of Maria's breakthrough had spread far beyond Technova. Tech blogs had written about it. Business magazines had featured it on their covers. Other companies had started creating their own versions of the real-world solutions division, but the real impact was happening in ways that nobody had expected. Maria had started getting letters from people around the world, janitors who'd been ignored when they pointed out problems, security guards who'd seen solutions that management had missed, cafeteria workers who'd noticed patterns that nobody else had spotted. One letter that stuck with her was from a woman named Patricia, who worked as a custodian at a major university. She'd been trying for years to tell the administration that their energy costs were so high because the heating and cooling systems were fighting each other. The system would heat a building in the morning, then immediately start cooling it because the thermostat was located right next to a large window, where the sun came in. Patricia had suggested moving the thermostat, but nobody had listened to her. After reading about Maria's story, Patricia had written up a detailed report about the problem. She'd included photos and even calculated how much money the university could save. This time, the administration had listened. They'd moved the thermostat, and their energy costs had dropped by 30%. Patricia had been promoted to facilities coordinator. The letters kept coming. A bus driver in Chicago who'd figured out a better route system. A grocery store cashier in Miami who'd solved an inventory tracking problem. A security guard in Denver who'd identified a major flaw in the building's fire safety system. All of them had been ignored before, but now they were being heard. Maria had started a program called Listen First. Companies could sign up to have their employees trained to recognize valuable insights from unexpected sources. The program taught managers to pay attention to the people who saw their systems from different angles. It taught them to ask questions like, "What problems do you notice that we might not see?" And "What would make your job easier?" The program had been so successful that major corporations were implementing it. One retail chain had discovered that their checkout problems weren't caused by slow computers, but by the way the barcode scanners were positioned. A custodian had noticed that cashiers were getting tired because they had to twist their wrists at an awkward angle to scan items. The company had repositioned the scanners, and checkout times had improved by 20%. But perhaps the most important change was happening in Maria's own family. Her daughter Sophia was now studying engineering at a top university, paid for by Maria's new salary. But more than that, Sophia had learned something valuable from watching her mother's transformation. "I used to think that smart people were only the ones with degrees and fancy titles," Sophia had told her mother during a recent phone call. "But you showed me that intelligence comes in all forms. You taught me to pay attention to what I see, not just what I'm told I should see." Sophia was already making an impact at her university. She'd started a program that brought together engineering students with people from other fields to solve real-world problems. They'd paired computer science majors with restaurant workers to improve food delivery apps. They'd connected mechanical engineering students with janitors to design better cleaning equipment. They'd brought together business students with bus drivers to create more efficient public transportation routes. The program had been so successful that other universities were copying it. The idea was simple: put technical knowledge together with real-world experience, and you get solutions that actually work. Maria had also started speaking at conferences and universities. The shy woman who'd once been afraid to speak up was now comfortable talking to rooms full of hundreds of people. Her message was always the same: good ideas can come from anywhere, and the most important skill any organization can have is the ability to listen. At one conference, a young programmer had asked her, "How do you know when someone's idea is worth listening to?" Maria had smiled. "You don't," she'd said. "That's the point. You can't tell just by looking at someone whether they have a good idea. You have to listen to everyone because the person with the solution might be the person you least expect." The ripple effects were still spreading. Technova's stock price had tripled since the night of the crisis. Other companies were seeing similar results when they started valuing diverse perspectives. The tech industry was slowly changing, becoming more inclusive, more willing to listen to voices that had been ignored before. But for Maria, the most important change was personal. She'd discovered that her voice mattered. She'd learned that her perspective was valuable. She'd found out that being different wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. Every morning when she walked into her office, she looked at a framed photo. On her desk, it was a picture of her and Sophia at Sophia's college graduation. In the photo, they were both smiling, both proud of how far they'd come. Next to the photo was a small sign that read, "Good ideas can come from anywhere. Are you listening?" Sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes they come from people who've been invisible for so long that we forget they're there. And sometimes they come from having the courage to speak up and the wisdom to listen when others do the same. Maria had learned that success wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being brave enough to share the answers you had, even when you weren't sure anyone would listen. And now, because of that courage, people all over the world were learning the same lesson. The cleaning lady who'd once been invisible had become impossible to ignore. And in doing so, she'd changed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who'd been waiting for someone to finally hear what they had to say.